Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. Yet another episode of Crushing Fantasy Football. I am Bryce Lockridge, your host of the show. All right, guys, today I'm going to be giving you a list of key adjustments that we need to make in fantasy football coming into the 2023 season. Now, as we know, fantasy football is a rapidly changing game, so things change on a year-to-year basis. So I want to make sure that y'all are staying ahead of the game. And so I'm going to give you these key adjustments and make sure to implement these things in 2023 to give yourself a huge advantage. So I'm going to start right here with the first thing on my list, and that is we need to be hammering the wide receiver button early. Just the way fantasy football works now, the wide receiver position is arguably more valuable than the running back position because, well, these wide receivers are coming out and seeing 15 targets in some weeks. There's wide receivers like Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson that legitimately come out and average more than 11 targets a game over the course of an entire season. So these players are incredibly polarizing in fantasy. And on top of that, there's so many split backfields now that it's really hard to build your team on a trio of three running backs. So if you're playing in the standard, ESPN leagues that has, two running backs, two wide receivers, and a flex, it's probably smarter now to just go ahead and construct your roster where you put a wide receiver at your flex because it's easier to build that 1-2-3 punch because there's more wide receivers that can give you, really high fantasy upside as opposed to running backs because there's just way too many split backfields now. So it's a lot harder to build your team on the running back position. So we need to be hammering the wide receiver button early. Either 3 out of your first 4 picks need to be a wide receiver or 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs. Under no circumstance would I draft 3 running backs and 1 wide receiver to start my draft. That's going to put you at a huge disadvantage. Either do 2 wide receivers and 2 running backs to start your draft or 3 wide receivers and 1 running back to start your draft. That is absolutely the best way that you can start your fantasy draft coming into this season. Next, I want you guys to make sure to pay attention to the strength of schedule, especially the playoff strength of schedule in players when you draft them. Because if you want to compete for a fantasy championship, one of the most important things, hands down, is your good players having a soft schedule for the fantasy playoffs. Because, matchups are tremendously important in fantasy, no matter what position you're looking at. So, if you're drafting a really good player, but they have a very, very tough strength of schedule, it gives you a huge advantage to go ahead and look ahead to those final 4 weeks of the fantasy football season and determine who's going to have a softer schedule than the other. Now, I'm not saying completely avoid a player if they're really, really good, but they have a tough playoff schedule. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you're in a spot where your decision is really hard between a couple different wide receivers or a couple different running backs or between a running back and a wide receiver that you both want, if you know the playoff strength of schedule, that could give you the tiebreaker in making your decision. So if you're ahead of the game and you're focusing on the last 4 weeks of the season where you're going to be competing for your championship and you have a tough decision in your draft, you could use the strength of schedule as a tiebreaker to determine which player you want to take. Next thing on my list is going to be prioritizing drafting for depth. Now, we see it every single season. People get so focused on filling out their starting lineups. They think they're going to win because their starting lineup looks awesome. And then half of their players underperform or half of their players get injured. And by the end of the season, they might not have a lineup that looks anything like their lineup was on draft day. So no matter how well you draft, your lineup's at least going to look a little bit different at the end of the season than it does on draft day. So if you're not drafting for depth, you're not really giving yourself a fair chance to win. Because, I look at all my fantasy championship rosters over the years, and even my best teams, 40 to 50% of the team is different by the end of the season than it was on draft day. But my backups that came in and that I got to plug in over my starters that either got injured or underperformed were awesome because I was drafting for depth. So you need to draft for depth. Don't draft a kicker or a defense until round 15 and 16. That's absolute nonsense. There's so many really good depth pieces that you could get later in the draft, like this year, like Donovan Peoples-Jones, Anthony Richardson, Dalton Kincaid, Van Jefferson, Zach Charbonnet. There's so many awesome late-round picks that you can get to bolster your depth in your lineup, and these guys could end up being starters by the end of the year. So instead of just being so focused on filling out your starting lineup, draft for depth. Don't be afraid to wait on a quarterback. Don't be afraid to wait on a tight end. I'm not saying you can't draft a quarterback early because quarterback is more important than it's ever been, but a lot of times what I'm doing in these drafts is I'm fading the other positions early, and I'm waiting and drafting a guy like Deshaun Watson, as a quarterback, or at least waiting on a guy like Justin Herbert that I could get in round 6 or 7. And I'm bolstering my depth until then and stacking the running back and wide receiver position because I know that no matter how juicy my lineup looks, some of these guys are going to bust and some of these guys are going to get hurt. So we need to make sure that we're prioritizing drafting for depth. You have to have depth to win in fantasy. Next on my list is I want you guys to focus on getting an awesome quarterback wide receiver stack. Now, this is obviously critically important because the quarterback position and the wide receiver position are both more important than they've ever been. So having an awesome quarterback wide receiver stack is pivotal to your success in fantasy. It used to be something fun to have, an awesome quarterback wide receiver stack, but a lot of times they just wouldn't really do much for you because the running back position was just by far and away the most important position in fantasy for a very long time. But now, as important as the quarterback position is, and as important as the wide receiver position is, it's very important to get these stacks. Now, there's stacks that you could get that come at an awesome value. Guys like Deshaun Watson, Amari Cooper, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase. Okay, a lot of these, you don't have to get the quarterback until rounds 5 or 6, sometimes even round like 7 on Deshaun Watson. And so you can get the quarterbacks at an awesome value. And when it comes to Amari Cooper, you can get him in the middle rounds. CeeDee Lamb and Jamar Chase are obviously going to have to get early. But the fact is, you can get these quarterbacks later in the draft and draft an awesome quarterback wide receiver stack and not even have to waste your first 1 and 2 picks on it like you would a stack like, Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. So make sure to get one of these value quarterback wide receiver stacks. It's going to be a pivotal piece to your fantasy team. Next on my list, you guys got to understand league format. Now, as fantasy football has evolved, there are more and more league formats that come about. And when you look at them now, the difference is immense. Like if you're doing an underdog best ball draft or your redraft ESPN league, the way you're going to draft in these leagues is tremendously different. On the underdog best ball drafts, you're pretty much going for high ceiling because you're competing against a field of 200,000 plus people in pretty much any draft you do an underdog for best ball and fantasy football. So, you're going for high ceiling players, even if they're, extremely risky. Whereas when you're in a redraft league, you want to eliminate risk and make sure that you're avoiding players that have a high bust potential, even if they do have a very high ceiling. So, the way that you're going to approach those two drafts is going to be vastly different. And then obviously PPR versus non-PPR, with the increased target share out of the backfield for running backs and the increased target share for wide receivers, there's a bigger difference between PPR and standard now than there ever has been. And while the rankings on these players used to be close, regardless of the league format, now the rankings can be vastly different between a PPR and a non-PPR league. So you've absolutely got to know the difference, and understand league format. Next on my list is when it comes to your in-season trading. And I am going to start to cover this stuff more because, we're getting closer and closer to the season. So all my advice isn't just going to be on drafting. I'm going to start focusing on, in-season strategy and advice. So when it comes to your in-season trading, you guys got to take advantage of the first 2 weeks. These are the overreaction weeks. These are the weeks where people draft a player and they expect them to go off every single week because they don't know how fantasy football works. And sometimes even a really good player busts in week 1 or 2. They overreact and they're ready to sell that player immediately. So do this. I've seen so many just ridiculous trades go down in fantasy. Like, last year, people selling Jamar Chase early after he didn't go off in weeks 1 and 2. Or he went off in week 1, but he didn't go off in week 2 and 3. He had a bad week 2 and 3, and then a lot of people sold him off their roster. Things like that. People, they overreact to the early weeks of the season. So take advantage of the first 2 weeks. It's the easiest week to manipulate the trade market. And then also when it comes to your in-season trading, make sure to pay attention to the strength of schedule for the playoffs as well for the people that you're trading for. So if you're doing a trade at the midway point of the season, you want to make sure that you're trading for players that have a soft schedule going into the fantasy playoffs. And I'm not saying that you can't get a player that has a tough schedule in the fantasy playoffs if they're a really good player, but just know the strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs is very important when executing a midseason trade. And another thing is don't trade just to trade, right? Trading's fun. Adding stud players to your roster is fun, but only do it if you need to. If you don't have a hole in your lineup, why give up something off your lineup that's been helping you if it's going to be a detriment to your team? Don't trade just to trade. If there's not a good reason and a reason to actually go after a player, don't trade just to do it. Next and final thing on my list, and this is more important than anything that I've talked about. In fact, if you don't do this, everything I've talked about really, it can only help you so much. It can help you, but not nearly as much as it will if you execute this. And what I want you guys to do is to play in multiple leagues. Now, whether this be underdog fantasy, best ball drafts, or redraft leagues, you've got to draft more than one team, right? On underdog fantasy, you're competing against such a large field that if you just draft one team and you invest $5 in a puppy draft and you expect to win first place and, win $150,000 in the puppy too, good luck. It's like punching a lottery ticket. But if you draft, 30, 35 really, really solid teams, you at least have a chance. It's still very slim odds in a field that big, but you can have a significantly better chance to actually win if you're drafting, a handful of teams as opposed to one. And then when it comes to your redraft leagues, the best way to gain an advantage in redraft leagues is to play in 5 or more leagues. I wouldn't play in less than 5 leagues if I was you guys. So obviously it's hard to find a league sometimes, but you could get on the internet, just do some research, find leagues. There's always people online looking for additional fantasy leagues to play in. Get in a league where you have an edge on your opponents and play in as many leagues as possible, because the bigger of a sample size you get against players you have an advantage against, the more money you're going to make playing fantasy. So make sure to play in multiple leagues and not just put all your eggs in one basket. All right, guys. Yeah, play in multiple leagues. Do all this. It's going to help you tremendously. I do appreciate you guys tuning into the video. Make sure to make these key adjustments so we can stay ahead of the game and have a winning season. See you later.